talk more about that over the next few minutes with our guests who will be joining us from New Delhi and Colombo. Right, so time now for our In Focus segment in which we are discussing about crisis hit Sri Lanka, banks on Japan, IMF for help. Crisis hit Sri Lanka, banks on Japan, IMF for help. And joining me are Mr. Gurjit Singh and Dr. Srimal Fernando. Mr. Singh is a former ambassador to Germany, Indonesia, ASEAN, Ethiopia and the African Union. He's also served in Sri Lanka. And Dr. Fernando is advisor, new regional diplomacy. He joins me from Colombo. Gentlemen, welcome to News Night. Mr. Singh, if I can start with you, I was going the text of Vikramasinghe's interview, and he talks about wanting to approach Japan for a meeting of foreign lenders. What do you make of his move on that front?
You're asking me? I'm sorry. Okay, so, I have written in the past we were the lead in alleviating the problem of Sri Lanka economically at present.
Right.
But the way Sri Lanka has placed its cards and got into a strategic cleft with China, it finds its hands that it cannot reach out to its best friend when it needs it most. Therefore, it is a natural you can see how silent Japan has been since January. They were missed with which Indo-Japanese proposals for infrastructure in Sri Lanka had been defeated by the Sri Lankan government, giving preference to the Chinese. Now, at the time of crisis, you go back to people who are ready to help you for humanitarian.
True.
At the time when everything is normal, you cock a snook at them. So I think in Japan and in India and in the region, there is a sense of deja vu about Sri Lanka. And unfortunately, it is a very divided opinion. There are people in India who also believe, why are we doing so much for Sri Lanka? When ultimately they will be ungrateful. And the docking of the Chinese ship has seen as a very early sign of that. On the other hand, there are people who see a wider policy, mature policy, which says, no, whatever may happen, you must continue to engage with your neighbors. And in this, Japan and India will be on the same.
Indeed. Dr. Fernando, coming to you now, in the interview on Thursday, Vikramasinghe also spoke about the fact that in his estimation, he has managed to stabilize the economy. Is that your reading as well?
There's some relief coming out after the youth uprising, which was pertaining for about 2 months.
Okay.
However, the major part of cushioning came from India with a 3.8 billion credit line extension under the Neighborhood First policy. Also, President Ranil Vikramasinghe is in negotiation with the International Monetary Fund, which gives a confident booster to the country's economy. And also that if there is a staff level agreement next month, it will bring some relief for the country. Also, another factor is there is a little bit of release for the citizens due to fuel management procedures that has come. But during the last few months, there has been a lot of queues, and these were the major reasons that people start coming onto the streets. So these are the factors that I see. A little bit slight inflation also has come down due to the normalcy, situation coming into normalcy. So these are few facts that is showing some positive signs at this moment.
Okay, Dr. Fernando, I was going through the text of Vikramasinghe's interview. Now, essentially, he makes a case for seeking debt restructuring. In other words, to revisit the terms of repayment of the loan that Sri Lanka owes to its foreign lenders, including China, Japan, and other countries in the region and beyond. Now, from an Indian perspective, somebody sitting in New Delhi would say that this is endemic to the region. Why? Because many a country has fallen prey to the lure of easy loan, easy money from foreign lenders such as China. Maldives is a good example, and both Maldives and Sri Lanka are now calling for a haircut, a debt restructuring. And is that something you think is one of the lessons or learnings from this entire crisis, this episode that's bothering many a country in South Asia today as we speak?
Yes, you are correct. This is the learning, because even you can see from the other neighboring countries like Bangladesh, Pakistan, as well as small neighbors like Sri Lanka and Maldives are also facing the same situation. I mean, pandemic was a major reason that foreign remittances and export earnings came down. And with that, the situation got worse, where there were no proper fiscal and monetary policy procedures in kind of small nations like that. Also, as a small nation, Sri Lanka, which is strategically positioned, has to balance between major nations as neighboring nations as well as traditional neighbors. So this is how I see, I mean, for your question, this is how I can answer.
Right. Yeah. Ambassador Singh, coming to you now, for someone like me sitting in New Delhi, I get the impression, in fact, I wonder sometimes whether Colombo has a fair understanding of, can it distinguish between a friend and foe? I see this because recently we saw the Chinese so-called research vessel docking at Hambantota port in spite of reservations expressed by New Delhi. And on the same level, we've seen New Delhi extend, assistance to Sri Lanka for the last many, many months now. From your perspective, you think Sri Lanka is playing both sides here, and you think it has a fair idea of who is to be trusted and who is not to be trusted in this, going forward as well?
I think Sri Lanka is at the rocky end of a long marriage. And by that time, you really don't know how to divorce somebody or how to find a new partner. And I think that is their problem. Now, the Chinese now, having given away Hambantota on a platter, which has no commercial value at the moment, therefore no returns, how could they stop the Chinese from using a port they own? Secondly, the Chinese deliberately embarrassed them at this time vis-a-vis us, because the Chinese could have easily gone to Gwadar, where they had been going in the past. They were hanging around Banda Aceh off the Nicobar coast, waiting for this permission. But they had made it a ploy that we are going to come to Hambantota, precisely make this point that even though we are not giving you economic relief, this is ours and we are going to be here. Now, it's a dual-use ship, but it's a dual-use policy, a dual-use port. Everything in Sri Lanka right now is being hit by dual-use. They need economic assistance, which China is not providing, but China wants its strategic rights to embarrass the friends of Sri Lanka who are providing it economic relief. Now, this is really the sign of a very badly managed partnership.
Badly managed partnership, says Ambassador Gurjit Singh. Dr. Fernando, with the benefit of hindsight, you think the Rajapaksas and Mahinda in particular made an error of judgment, one, when he turned to China for the Hambantota port project, and two, when he found it difficult to repay the loan, he literally gave the port on a lease for 100 years to China. So in hindsight, you think that could have been eminently avoidable?
Yes, you are correct. Sri Lanka, at that point, when the Hambantota port was given, it was the 2015-2019 government under Maitripala Ranil Wickremesinghe government. But the Hambantota port was built during previously during President Mahinda Rajapaksa's period, and this was leased out for a 90-year lease during the previous regime, as I said. But in 2019, Sri Lanka manifested a new foreign policy doctrine called the India First foreign policy, where it assured that Sri Lanka will not jeopardize the security or strategic interest of India. However, it has to balance its economic policies or economic diplomacy with traditional neighbors or traditional partners. In this regard, about the ship, I would say it is, according to the Foreign Ministry and the Defense Ministry, they say that this ship cannot do any scientific research in Sri Lanka, and it was only for refurbishment that it has come for fuel and other needs. However, Sri Lanka has to be mindful of securing the security interest of India at every point, because it's the nearest neighbor which Sri Lanka is the most trusted partner, and it's always helpful. And the neighborhood first policy has to go on an interdependence policy with India and Sri Lanka. Yeah.
Dr. Fernando, I have a twofold question to you, and this I'm asking from a Sri Lankan people's perspective. I say that because protests are on even as we speak. It might have petered down, but it's still very much visible in Colombo as we speak. Now, yes. At the same time, going forward, looking ahead, the IMF will likely impose austerity measures on Sri Lanka, which might again be a pain point, which might again come to the detriment of the ordinary Sri Lankan taxpayer, ordinary Sri Lankan, person. You think the people of Sri Lanka have this, need to brace themselves for what is going to happen in the future as well?
Yes, of course. For the next 2-3 years, Sri Lanka is going to have a very hard time economically.
Do you think are they prepared for it?
I don't think so. I mean, people are now realizing with electricity tariffs going up, the inflation going up, it's just that there is some easiness due to fuel distribution procedures coming into the picture, and some welfare procedures, but this is not going to ease off. Election is a must in the coming few months, because then only the people's mandate can be tested. However, there is going to be council elections coming up in March 2023. But followed by a general election would be the best procedure for the government to adopt. But however, the president, the executive president, has 2.5 years mandate, and these are the tussles between the citizens as well as the political setup as well as the opposition, and also the growing concerns of welfare policies being cut off for the public is going to be a very painful procedure that Sri Lanka will encounter in the next 2-3 years.
Absolutely. Ambassador Singh, I want to take that question to you as well. From a popular Sri Lankan people's perspective, if I can put it that way, you think the IMF, in the likelihood of it imposing austerity measures on Sri Lanka, that will compound, add to the people's woes who are already reeling under inflation and other economic fallouts?
Yeah, so 3 points. First, India's development cooperation is nowhere starkly more different than in Sri Lanka. Ours is a people-oriented and theirs is a regime-oriented system. Secondly, the structural problem of the Sri Lankan economy, low tourism, low remittances, low exports, this is not going away in a hurry. So this is a long-term problem. And meanwhile, you have a bill which you can't afford. So as coming to your main question, yes, the IMF will give you money, but will impose such severe strictures like cutting your defense forces, which are really bloated. Since the victory over the LTT, they've never cut down their army. That is one. The civil service, selling of public assets. India can help by opting to train laid off civil servants and defense people for alternate employment. India can offer to invest in the public sector, which is going to be disinvested, and try and make them profitable, even by bringing in private Indian companies. So I think we need to take a pragmatic and yet clearly economic outlook towards helping our people.
Indeed. Dr. Fernando, how would this also impact, for instance, on defense spending for that matter? Because we are given to understand that once the IMF talks come through, they might very well impose in the proper budget to be presented for 2023 by the President, we might see some defense spending cuts as well.
Because defense budget is around US dollars 1.8 billion, comprising the expenditure going on to the tri-forces as well as the police. And with these new austerity measures, definitely defense expenditure being cut off will be severely impacting the security apparatus, because around 300 service personnel are there, as well as it is spending on other aspects. So this is going to be a major challenge for the national security forces as well as the defense budget when it comes to national policy and nation building. Yeah.
Indeed. Ambassador Singh, last couple of questions starting with you. We're given to understand that the protesters, even though their numbers might be diminishing, they're still insisting on a couple of issues, couple of demands. One, abolition of executive presidency, and two, release of all pro-democracy protesters who have been arrested in the last several months. You think these two issues, especially presidency issue, will gain traction going forward as well?
Yes, I think it will, because at the moment you have the 12th man of a cricket team as the captain. So he is basically being run by a party which is not his. His job is to make sure the economy gets back, but the large number of MPs may want that executive presidency powers to return to parliament, which will make the next parliament more powerful than it is now. I think every MP dreams of having that power. But at the same time, some of the issues that the struggle, Garaglia has made, are that it's a death knell of traditional political parties in Sri Lanka. I'm not certain they are ready to go that far, masquerade themselves on the kind of reform Garaglia seeks.
Right.
So I think there you have a problem. Now Araglia believes that the elections are the solution, whereas the president believes the IMF is the solution. So you think again you got to decide whether the budget comes first or whether your controls of the family come first.
Indeed.
Not a happy situation at all.
Indeed, without doubt. And finally to you, Dr. Fernando, your last thoughts on a couple of issues as well. For instance, what do you make of India's role so far and India's role going forward as well? Number one. And number two, from your, in your estimation, what's the challenges ahead for Wickremesinghe himself as the new president in the shorter term?
Yes, coming back to your question, as the nearest neighbor and the closest neighbor which has stood by Sri Lanka's most difficult time, citizens appreciate that. And even during the Aragalia, most of the political parties from the opposition are leftist inclining. And they also have now understood India is the key to resolving, because no other country came into the picture when the citizens and the country was in trouble. However, there has been a political transition from Gotabaya Rajapaksa's time to new President Ranil Wickremesinghe's period. His challenges in the next 2 years as a president will be to take this country out of this economic mess, debt restructuring. So when debt restructuring comes in, there will be job cuts, tax increases that will hit businesses as well as the general public, and to move people out of poverty, as well as there are about 5 million people vulnerable at this point due to this situation. I mean, there's food scarcity in these people. They will be having 1 meal per day. So how to make 3 meals per day for them, and all these elements are the key factors that the new president and the new government will face, as well as how Sri Lanka looks, because India is the only nation that stood by Sri Lanka with a $3 billion neighborhood first extension. So that's very much, yeah.
Right, on that note, may I thank both my guests, Dr. Srimal Fernando in Colombo and Ambassador Gurjit Singh, for making time for us here on Newsnight. Thank you for your time, gentlemen. Appreciate it. Thank you. Right, and now to an update on the Ukraine-Russia conflict.